Most people avoid cold water instinctively. The body recoils from it. The mind generates reasons not to do it, and that reaction, the sharp intake of breath, the impulse to get out, the visceral discomfort, turns out to be exactly the mechanism that makes cold water exposure one of the most well-documented interventions for nervous system function available. The discomfort is not incidental. It is the point. What cold water does to the body in the first 30 seconds is a stress response. A real one, Segi and Abro, a real one, the same category of biological activation as the fight or flight response, involving the same hormonal machinery. And what happens in the minutes after that initial response is what most people who practice cold exposure are actually after. Understanding the sequence changes how you think about it, not as a wellness trend or a test of toughness, but as a deliberate physiological intervention with a documented mechanism, one that, practiced consistently, produces measurable changes in how the nervous system handles stress over time. The first thing cold water does when it contacts the skin is activate a set of receptors called thermoreceptors, specifically the TRPM8 receptors, which are sensitive to temperatures below approximately 15 degrees Celsius. The activation of these receptors sends an immediate signal to the brainstem, which interprets the cold stimulus as a threat requiring rapid response. The response is coordinated and fast. The sympathetic nervous system activates. Adrenaline, epinephrine releases from the adrenal medulla. Heart rate increases. Blood vessels in the skin and extremities constrict, redirecting blood toward the core to protect vital organs. Breathing becomes faster and shallower. The body is in a genuine acute stress state within seconds of cold water contact. This is the gasping response that most people experience in the first moments of cold exposure. It is not weakness. It is the autonomic nervous system doing exactly what it was designed to do in response to a cold threat. But something else is happening simultaneously. Something that most discussions of cold exposure do not emphasize enough. Norepinephrine, also called noradrenaline, is released in significant quantities during cold water exposure, from both the adrenal glands and directly from neurons in the brain. And the magnitude of this release is not trivial. A study conducted by Rhonda Patrick and colleagues examining cold water immersion at 14 degrees Celsius for 1 hour found that norepinephrine levels increased by approximately 300% compared to baseline, 300% from a single session of cold exposure. Norepinephrine is not simply a stress hormone in the way cortisol is. Its functional role is more specific and more immediately relevant to cognitive and emotional performance. Norepinephrine is the primary neurotransmitter of focus, alertness, and mood regulation in the central nervous system. It is the neurochemical basis of the sharpened attention you feel in a genuinely engaging situation. It drives motivation, reduces the perception of fatigue, and regulates the emotional response to stressful events. When norepinephrine is chronically low at a state associated with depression, ADHD, chronic fatigue, and burnout, the subjective experience is flat affect, poor motivation, difficulty concentrating, and a blunted emotional response to things that should be rewarding or interesting. Norepinephrine deficiency is a primary target of several classes of antidepressant medications, specifically because of how directly it governs mood and cognitive engagement. Cold water exposure produces a norepinephrine spike through a non-pharmacological mechanism. The effect is not as sustained as medication, and it does not address the underlying causes of chronic deficiency, but as an acute intervention, something that reliably produces a rapid increase in norepinephrine within minutes. It has few parallels in terms of accessibility and cost. The subjective experience that most people report immediately after cold exposure, convenience affordabi nu enias nu wadi nu the sense of alertness, the mood elevation, the reduced perception of stress, is the norepinephrine response. This is not a story people tell themselves to feel good about having done something uncomfortable. It is a neurochemical event with a documented biological mechanism. Dopamine levels also increase during cold exposure, though the magnitude and duration of the dopamine response to cold is different from the norepinephrine response. A study by Vertanen and colleagues found that cold water immersion produced a sustained dopamine elevation that persisted for several hours after the exposure ended. Unlike the rapid spike and return of dopamine associated with food or social media, the dopamine response to cold exposure rose gradually and remained elevated. This prolonged dopamine elevation is part of why the mood effects of cold exposure often last significantly longer than the exposure itself. The sustained dopamine signal continues influencing motivation, emotional tone, and the sense of engagement with the environment for hours, not the brief peak and trough associated with dopamine responses to most immediate rewards. The combination of elevated norepinephrine and sustained dopamine elevation after cold exposure creates a neurochemical environment that's associated with better mood, sharper focus, and greater motivation. These are not side effects. They are the primary functional output of the biological response to cold stress. The parasympathetic rebound is the mechanism that most people interested in stress resilience find most significant, and it is also the least commonly explained part of cold exposure biology. The acute response to cold water is sympathetic. Heart rate up, blood pressure up, adrenaline surging, but the body does not sustain maximum sympathetic activation indefinitely. As the initial shock of cold contact becomes more familiar to the nervous system, within the first 30 to 60 seconds of exposure, the parasympathetic system begins to assert itself as a counter-regulatory mechanism. Heart rate begins to slow slightly even while still in cold water as the vagus nerve, the primary pathway of the parasympathetic system, increases its activity in response to the sustained stress. Breathing begins to regulate. The initial gasping gives way to a more controlled respiratory pattern if the person stays in and does not exit the cold immediately. This is the window that experienced cold exposure practitioners learn to navigate. To CD in May in Nawa Wazi in Day in Nawa in Dawa ORC in Nay and Nay in Nay, the transition from the initial sympathetic peak to the beginning of parasympathetic counter-regulation. It typically occurs somewhere in the 30 to 90-second range and is associated with a subjective shift from acute distress to something more tolerable, even calm. What this transition represents at the physiological level is the nervous system actively regulating itself in response to sustained stress. The parasympathetic system is not waiting for the stressor to end before activating. It is activating during the stressor in real time as a counterbalancing response. This is the training effect that repeated cold exposure appears to produce over time. The nervous system that has repeatedly navigated the transition from acute sympathetic activation to parasympathetic counter-regulation becomes more efficient at that transition. The initial sympathetic spike in response to stressors, cold or otherwise, remains because the acute stress response is not something that gets eliminated through training, but the recovery, the speed with which the parasympathetic system reasserts control and the nervous system returns to baseline, becomes faster and more efficient. A study published in PLOS 1 examined the physiological responses of experienced cold exposure practitioners compared to naive participants. The experienced group showed the same initial sympathetic activation in response to cold as the naive group, but their recovery measured by heart rate variability returning toward baseline was significantly faster. The acute stress response had not diminished. The recovery capacity had increased. This distinction is important. The goal of cold exposure training is not to stop feeling stress. It is to become more efficient at recovering from it, which is precisely what stress resilience means in physiological terms. Not the absence of stress response, but the speed and completeness of recovery from it. The long-term effects of consistent cold exposure on baseline stress reactivity operate through several overlapping mechanisms. First, repeated activation of the norepinephrine system through cold exposure appears to produce adaptive changes in norepinephrine signaling over time. The system becomes more responsive and more efficient, with some research suggesting that baseline norepinephrine tone is higher in people who practice cold exposure regularly compared to those who do not. Second, the repeated practice of staying in cold water through the acute discomfort phase, choosing not to exit despite the strong impulse to do so, trains a specific form of interoceptive regulation. Interoception is the awareness of internal bodily states. Interoceptive regulation is the capacity to feel an uncomfortable internal state, the cold stress, the urge to escape, and choose a behavioral response that is not purely reactive. This capacity is not limited to cold exposure. Research on interoceptive regulation suggests that it transfers across contexts. People who develop stronger interoceptive regulation through practices that involve tolerating and navigating uncomfortable internal states show improved capacity for emotional regulation in other high-stress contexts. The cold is training a skill that applies beyond the shower. Third, the anti-inflammatory effects of regular cold exposure contribute to baseline stress reactivity through a parallel mechanism. Cold exposure reduces baseline inflammatory markers over time. Lower baseline inflammation is associated with reduced emotional reactivity to stress, better mood stability, and improved cognitive performance under pressure. A 2014 study published in PLOS One found that people who regularly took cold showers reported fewer sick days than those who did not, suggesting measurable immune system effects from consistent cold exposure. The proposed mechanism involves the repeated activation and resolution of the immune stress response, which over time may train the immune system toward more efficient and less excessive responses to challenge. Here is what the research supports practically. The temperature threshold for meaningful thermoreceptor activation and norepinephrine response is approximately 15 degrees Celsius or below. Most cold tap water in temperate climates falls in the range of 10 to 15 degrees, sufficient to produce the physiological response without requiring ice water or specialized equipment. Duration matters, but not in the way most people expect. The research on cold exposure benefits does not require long exposures. The norepinephrine response occurs rapidly. We're seeing in go ors and bo or and do or in bo or and go or and go or in bo within the first minute of cold contact. The parasympathetic transition occurs in the 30 to 90 second range. A cold shower of 2 to 3 minutes appears sufficient to produce the acute neurochemical and physiological effects that drive the benefits. The timing of cold exposure within the day affects the experience significantly. Cold exposure in the morning produces a more dramatic subjective effect because the norepinephrine and dopamine response is occurring against a relatively low baseline of arousal. Cold exposure in the evening is generally not recommended by sleep researchers because the sympathetic activation it produces can delay sleep onset. Morning or midday is the better window for most people. The adaptation period is real and worth acknowledging. The first several sessions of cold exposure are the most difficult because the nervous system has no prior context for the stimulus and the acute response is maximal. With repeated exposure, the initial shock diminishes somewhat. Not because the physiology changes dramatically, but because the cognitive anticipation of the experience becomes less threatening as the outcome becomes predictable and familiar. The practice becomes easier. The physiological benefits remain. Contrast exposure, alternating between hot and cold, is a protocol used in athletic recovery and physical therapy contexts. The vasodilation from heat followed by vasoconstriction from cold creates a pumping effect in peripheral circulation that accelerates metabolic waste and for people who find pure cold exposure that difficult to sustain, starting with a warm shower and ending with a cold finish is a viable protocol that still produces meaningful cold exposure effects. Here's the synthesis. The body's response to cold is a stress response, acute, real, physiologically significant. And the reason cold exposure produces benefits rather than harm comes down to one variable: duration and resolution. Cold exposure produces a stress response that resolves completely within minutes. The sympathetic activation peaks, the parasympathetic system counterbalances, the body returns to baseline. The stress was real, the recovery was complete, and the nervous system that undergoes this sequence repeatedly becomes more efficient at the recovery phase. Not just for cold, but for stress responses in general. Chronic stress is harmful because it does not resolve. The activation persists. The recovery never fully occurs. The system stays in a state it was designed to occupy briefly. Brief cold exposure is the opposite pattern: full activation, complete resolution, repeated practice of the recovery, and a neurochemical environment elevated norepinephrine, sustained dopamine, that produces measurable improvements in mood, focus, and motivation for hours after each session. This is not about being tough. It is not about proving something. It is about giving the nervous system a stimulus that it is specifically designed to respond to and recover from. In ZD and Sur and I das in Bo and Z and Sur and Dasur and Tur, and using the recovery as training for the stress resilience that the same nervous system needs in every other area of life. 2 to 3 minutes, below 15 degrees, in the morning. That is the whole protocol. If this changed how you think about something as simple as turning the tap to cold, hit the like button. Share it with someone who has been curious about cold exposure but never understood what it actually does.